He seems to be in now then, so we'll make a start.
Okay, it is recording, Charles.
Okay, thanks, Gareth. Before I forget, in case any of you aren't aware, could I make you aware that on the 18th of October we are running a coach to London for the Rejoin March. It'll pick up along the M4, starting at Swansea West. It'll stop at Bridgend services. It'll go into Cardiff City Centre, pick up from the Students' Union in Park Place. Then, if there's demand for it to stop at Magor services, it will. And then it'll stop at Lee Delmere services. And we're anticipating that some people from Gloucestershire, Bath and Swindon might join us there. So it's heavily subsidised. We've intentionally running the coach at a loss. So it's £25. And if you want to join the coach, I suppose the quickest way is for you to contact Gareth, should we say that? If they want
I'm not here for the next fortnight.
Okay.
So it'll be Joe. Joe will be sending notifications.
Sorry, yes. Excellent. Joe can coordinate that. Then if you contact Joe, if you want to join the coach. And Joe has put a note up saying that 1/3 of the tickets are already sold. Get them while you can. Okay. Right, I won't mess around anymore. I'll hand over to Mick. The format of our conversations, Mick, are very informal. We'll hand over to you to speak and introduce yourself and say what you want to say. Say 10 to 15 minutes, then it'll be over to Q&A. So if you want to ask a question or make a point, just indicate that by clicking on the appropriate icon. Over to you, Mick. I'll leave it to you to introduce yourself in case there's anybody there.
Okay, well,
over to you.
Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me to contribute to this. I chair now the cross-party group on Europe in the Senate, and it is cross-party. It is mainly Labour, Plaid Cymru and Lib Dem. We think there are some closet conservatives who are sympathetic. It's a great pity that we've lost one or two that were very supportive in the past at the last election. And of course, part of the purpose to the cross-party group is to raise the profile of a whole series of issues around Europe that now impact on the Senate. So I don't claim to be an expert in all these areas. Of course, previously as the Minister of the Constitution in the Welsh Government and as Counsel General, the Welsh equivalent of Attorney General, I did intervene during the Article 50 case when we were in the process of leaving the European Union. And of course, the challenge there was whether the UK government could do it using the royal prerogative or whether it had to be by legislation through Parliament. And of course, the courts upheld the role of Parliament within that. We still had Brexit, but it enabled Parliament at least to intervene in terms of a whole series of issues that arose around the way in which we left the European Union. The impact of Brexit on Wales has been very significant, and in many ways, a lot of it is not very well understood. So I'm just going to comment on a few of those areas, and they're areas that are important, and it's one of the reasons why we have the cross-party group. I, of course, am not standing again for the next Senate as I begin to approach my 72nd birthday, time to make way for new blood. But it's important that this group is up and running and has continuity into the next Senate. It may well be the case that there are other political parties represented on the Senate with our new proportional voting system. So the debates are likely to get louder, and it's important people understand the impact. Just to say one thing about some of the polls that are appearing, which are very interesting because I think they are beginning to show a very clear sea change, that after 9 years, Brexit hasn't delivered any of the things that were promised. In fact, the exact opposite. And I think there's an increasing understanding and realization now that that is the case. I don't think that means the case that those that were hardcore Brexiteers at the time have changed their mind. In fact, there is a sort of denial position that's sort of adopted, a sort of UK MAGA version, which is, oh yeah, but the reason it hasn't worked is because of the politicians. So basically, it's always someone else's fault, not actually the Brexit itself. For me, the biggest issue, or one of the biggest issues with Brexit and the way it's impacted on Wales, is in fact a constitutional one. When we were part of the European Union, there was a sort of broad constitutional umbrella within which Wales existed. That was important because it created a framework within which devolved governments could operate and in which devolved responsibilities could function within a recognized framework internationally. Of course, it was the UK government that is recognised within the European Union when we were a member. But of course, we had what was a subnational status, and that very much recognised the various structures around Europe in terms of federal structures, sub-federal structures. But it meant that in areas where responsibility was wholly devolved to Wales, you look at agriculture, you look at fisheries, you look at certain aspects of the environment, certain aspects of legislation, health, and so on. Um, uh, we would be able to engage at an international level, at the European level, in our own right. We actually had a status, we could influence what happened, and we had a particular role to play. Having left the European Union, that subnational status has gone. And of course, we had a number of years of a very centralizing Conservative government that was actually determined that there would be no effective devolved role that wasn't subservient to the role of Westminster in London. I have to say, I don't think a great deal has actually changed. We had the Internal Market Act that was introduced. This really was something that was introduced by the Conservative government over how to regulate the internal market, despite the fact that an enormous amount of really quality cooperative work had taken place to develop common frameworks in all those areas. That previously came within that European Union framework, but in order to ensure a working and a credible internal market within the UK. Now, of course, the UK government is looking at this, but I don't believe there is any significant indication that UK government is going to repeal the Internal Market Act. I believe it should be repealed. I think it is an obstacle to proper devolved cooperation and devolved government. But I'm afraid it's another example of centralized governments hanging on to powers and even consolidating powers centrally when they come into power. So I think there is an issue over the Internal Market Act that is important within Wales, amongst a number of other constitutional issues on which I have written and will be continuing to write and giving a various number of lectures on, because I think it's important that these things are not forgiven. But I think it's also important as part of the European debate to understand that as well as the economic and social impacts of Brexit, it has also had a very significant impact on the way in which Welsh Government can actually carry out its devolved functions. So we've lost the subnational status that we actually held. We've also suffered financially as a result, and that becomes clear. I was walking around Pontypridd today and looking at the various signs of things that had received financing from European structural funds. For a while, I chaired the WIFO, was in Europe funding office committee, which governed really the way in which European funds were managed within Wales. That's estimated at between £1 to £2 billion over the past 10 years or so. It hasn't been replaced, and it hasn't been replaced in the way in which it was promised that it would. and as a consequence, also, we have a number of additional funds that presume to, levelling up funds and so on, that purport to replace European funding, but are very much within a centralised Westminster control. I have no problem with councils and organisations getting that funding. If there's funding available, you get it and you use it. But it doesn't play a role in a strategic way, in a long-term strategic way, and it makes no sense. And in fact, it is a way of undermining devolution. There are a number of other areas that are very significantly affected by Brexit when we look back on the past few years. When I was Council General, one of the things I did, I think back in 2016, 17, I went to visit those that enforce our fisheries, our fishery stocks, and so on. And I remember it was a sort of tongue-in-cheek comment that I made, sort of joke at the time, which I think a lot of the local fishermen were very, very pro-Brexit, and I said, well, what will happen is that people will be waking up in Wales on a Saturday and saying, "Oh God, not bloody lobster again." And part of the reason is that a lot of the fishery produce that we have is exported, and if you can't export it quickly, it is non-exportable. And the obstacles to that mean that basically then you either don't fish for it, you either eat it or consume it. It was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek comment, but it raised a lot of anger with the some of the small fishermen at the time. But I think it's one of those things that it was said in jest, but is one of the things that has actually happened. Agricultural produce, the restrictions on agricultural produce, the bureaucracy around that, around our fishery produce, around our cockles, around our whelks, and a lot of our produce that goes abroad is something that is now faces considerable difficulties and has resulted in, I think, a number of businesses either ceasing to operate or certainly changing the way in which they operate. So the number of trade obstacles, the same aspect of manufacturing as well. And of course, we've seen the impact more recently of the through traffic that would come from Northern Ireland through Wales, and the reductions in that as basically traders and transporters seek to bypass having to come through the UK and then go through the various export controls. And I think that is something that is significant. And it's very difficult to sort of estimate the precise impacts. Those are things that are being continually evaluated. But there is no doubt that Brexit has had a significant impact on our Welsh economy. We export more to the EU than the UK does. We have a higher impact likelihood from the restrictions. And the impact on Welsh economy has certainly been a dulling impact. It is certainly not one that has given any benefit to the Welsh economy, and it's one that's clearly being evaluated. And that's why we do welcome the closer moves now with UK government in terms of trade agreements and so on. It's not completely clear how those are going to work, but there is obviously a lot closer relationship. There's a lot of work that is going on to that effect. The assessed impact on the Welsh economy is around 4 billion over a period of time. The effect on the UK economy is greater at a time when the main objective, we're told, of UK government is economic growth. I think it raises very much to the to the front, the issue of rejoining the European Union. It makes absolutely no sense in the current world we're in, with the conflict that we have, what is happening in Ukraine, with the realignment of geopolitics within that particular area, and the importance of European leaders being able to work together collectively. Surely we must now be moving to a stage where we should be looking to rejoin the
Amen.
European Union. I think there is now a growing desire for something like that to begin to happen. So that is a framework we're in particular. We, of course, suffered the loss of Erasmus. And in fact, we weren't allowed to set up our own Erasmus program by the EU or by the UK government. So we set up TIFE, which is a Wales International Learning Program, and it's very interesting that now we're looking at the re-establishment of, and from a recent delegation that I was on that travelled to Brussels, met with the UK ambassador to the EU and various EU bodies. They're very interested in the scope of the TIFE program that we actually have as being perhaps a potential model. This is a £10 million Welsh model to basically maintain with schools, youth, adult, further education, higher education. This is about engagement with the world, and that will be interesting to see how that develops. We did also raise one of the impacts, the cultural impacts, and the impacts on musicians and bands and etc. being able to operate in Europe and the restrictions that are there. That's certainly something that is on the agenda, but it's something that is very low down on the agenda. But it was something that clearly we wanted to raise. Very interested in some of the opinion polls coming out now, which just looking at the Mirror one, which is bound to be more weighted towards pro EU, but 66 to 68% of people said they would support a second referendum. 78% of the population say they don't feel better as a result of the European Union being outside the European Union. And I think it's like a perfect storm of momentum, of issues, of feelings at this moment in time. That despite the fact that there are political conflicts between left and right and within various political organisations, I think there's a growing feeling within Wales and certainly within the UK that the promises that were made have not been delivered, that they can't be delivered, that people can see how important it is that the UK does actually have a closer engagement with the European Union. Some of us would like to see that happen a lot quicker, and we'd like to actually see back on the agenda the issue of rejoining the European Union. And part of the purpose of the cross-party group is to explore those issues, to understand the impact of Brexit on the Welsh economy, to look at ways in which we can improve our relationship with the European Union through and with European countries through our devolved functions and responsibilities, and to basically contribute to keeping this as part of the political progressive agenda. I think that's all I really wanted to say around that. I hope that's given a bit of food for thought and potential to ask some questions. I hope I haven't gone on too long.
Thank you, Mick. So we open the floor now to questions. Anybody want to raise a hand? Sally, please unmute yourself.
Right. Should be unmuted now.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good. It is working. Okay. What I wanted to ask about is that, yes, the opinion polls are changing, and there are many more people now saying that they're obviously not terribly happy with the fact that we've left the EU. One of the real problems for me, though, is that the people who are able to form the opinion, that control the propaganda, generally tend to be the people with money, whether they're managing the mainstream media or they have access to social media and are able to influence what a lot of people are thinking. These are people with a lot of money. They're putting money into some of the political parties that are actually anti-EU. And I think my question on that one is that what can be done about this with all this wealth going into the pro-Brexit side? We certainly see this in the media, which is very, very much still pro-Brexit.
Okay, do you want me to take them one at a time, or do you want to take several at a time?
It's
I'm happy.
probably best to do it one at a time, Mick.
Okay. Well, listen, Sally. I don't really have the answer to that. The issue of foreign money coming in is something that is deeply concerning within our politics, and is something that I don't think is being very adequately addressed. There are restrictions on what we can do within Wales within our own framework, in terms of our own elections and our own politics. So basically, the issue of political funding and so on is not a devolved matter that we have uh, power over, but it is something that needs to be addressed. GB News, which is intensely well funded, is almost exactly a sort of replica of Fox News and is a political propaganda journal for the far right and for the right wing politics. We also see the people who are the main spokespersons on this, and it has a simplistic attraction to it. Um, the issue of false information being put out and the sorts of arguments that are being put out at the moment by the sort of reform politics um, are very deeply concerning. I see the issue of Brexit. Brexit is a significant factor in the increase in people coming through on small boats and whatever it is coming into the UK, because we don't have the framework within the EU now in which to actually deal with that in a fair and a rule of law way, with obligations to the conventions that we're signed up to. So it is a major challenge. We know that there was a major issue of funding interfering, so particularly Russian money, and that was influencing this issue as well. So, I'm certainly of the view that there is a need for a legislative framework and greater control over the ability of foreign money to come in and to influence our political system and our social media and so on. We don't within Wales have the power to do that, but I think it is something that government. What are your thoughts,
Okay,
Sally?
thank you for that. Liz, have you lowered your hand? Or
No. Hi, may I ask a question?
go on.
Hi, I'd like two questions, please, if possible. The first one is, how active are Welsh MPs in the Westminster APPG on Europe and also in the EU-UK Parliamentary Partnership Assembly? And the second one would be, I expect you know the European movement has an informal working group on European local partnerships and twinning, which I'm a member of. And we've heard quite a lot from local authorities across England on how they're managing to go on collaborating with European partners, not least in Horizon Europe. So I'm wondering how this is going in Wales. I really don't know how the local authorities are getting on and whether traditional twinning is having a new lease of life, for example. So it'd be great to know more about it.
Okay, I mean, I don't have the sort of detail of the answer to that, because certainly when I was in Brussels a few weeks back, what had become clear is, of course, there remains the Welsh office, the Welsh base within the European Union, within Brussels, as there was before. That engages, it influences, it seeks information, it seeks to present information relevant to Wales in the various discussions that are going on. As you know, Derek Vaughan remains, he's going to be retiring shortly, though, a sort of ambassador for the Welsh government in Brussels, and it's a very important role that he has carried out. And that was certainly confirmed to us by a lot of the different governmental bodies that we met with within Brussels. But what is also clear, though, is that individual bodies like higher education bodies have maintained their own presence. So you have an engagement there. You have the same with local authorities doing the same thing. So there's a high degree of engagement and also cultural engagement as well. I think probably what we don't have is the sufficient, this is my um, sort of viewing of it, from reflecting from what I remember when I was a member of the Committee of the Regions and was regularly in Brussels, and compared to now, is the degree of coordination between all those different bodies and a common agenda. It's partly impacted by the fact that we don't have that subnational role anymore within the European Union in order to actually pull some of those, that there is a need for, I think, a far greater um, uh, input into the Wales office, and a far more strategic and coordinated role within Brussels. And I think maybe the current trade arrangements and the growing collaboration may mean that that becomes far more possible, far more viable. But it will need, I think, additional resources from Welsh Government. I think it will need additional direction from Welsh Government. And I think it will need far greater ministerial input into Europe, because I think that's where we're beginning to head back to. I can't hear anyone now. I don't know.
So, well, thank you for me.
Okay.
Marion,
Thanks.
I think, is next. And can we ask Marion to unmute?
Yeah. Okay. Marion, would you like to come in, please?
Yeah, thank you very much. Apologies if I missed this point in your presentation, but what do the polls show for the thoughts of young people who are too young to vote in the Brexit referendum, but are very definitely in the electorate now?
Oh,
And just as an anecdote, not that it could have happened, but I do remember during the Brexit referendum debates, young people saying that they should have 2 votes because their life expectancy was such that the implications of the referendum would have a much greater impact on those of us of a slightly more mature age. If only that could have been
yeah.
allowed, we'd have had a different result. But the
Well,
question is,
it's an interesting change, isn't it? Because one, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, listen. The first thing is, I think we need to be very careful with polls, because polls are tending to reflect attitudes and feelings and so on. But you don't know what might actually happen if there were a referendum. I put it a bit like this. Apologise for anyone that's a sort of ardent sort of independence campaign. But when you people, if they would an opportunity to vote on independence, would vote for, etc. What that doesn't really answer is how important is that amongst all the other things that they are concerned about. The assumption automatically that if people say that, that means it's the most important thing that they have in their mind, that they don't. And so whereas there is a sort of growing interest in independence, when you look at the sort of breakdown of analysis and so on, it actually is quite low down compared to health, compared to pensions, financial issues, and so on. So you have to take these things with a pinch of salt. That what might happen if there were another referendum? Does it mean that this would automatically into support? Now, from my reading of the polls, and I do this very sort of tongue in cheek, to be honest, is that you certainly had the proportion of younger people, the support for Europe is much, much greater. You're talking about a long beyond post-war generation who's internationally, in terms of social media, their engagement, in terms of their music, the things they watch, the things they do, the things they're interested in, are far less confined than perhaps older generations. And it is true that, as we're 9 years on. Well, during that 9 years, there have probably been a lot more people who are absolutely ardent Brexiteers, etc., that have passed away than those that are supporting of EU membership. So it's no doubt, I think, that there is inevitably that demographic change that takes place. But converting that into greater organised support from young people, I don't think is quite as easy. I think that young people are much more open, far less prejudiced again in the way in which people were during the Brexit referendum and the debate that led to that. I get worried, for example, about the percentage of young people interested in reform politics, because that means that there's a lot of superficial, not quite as clear cut or solid as we make it. And part of the reason for having these meetings, part of the reason for having the campaigns that we have, is in order to basically to consolidate that, to make that a much more solid political basis for a future referendum and for future change and a future re-engagement with the Europe. I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's how it seems to me at the moment, that there is a change. That change is partly affected by demography. It's also partly affected by the fact that people can see that many of them can see that they were lied to, or the promises that were made just didn't happen. So I think, you have to be very, very careful about over interpreting and over assuming from what we read in the polls.
Mick,
Yeah, thank you.
do you think people are making a connection between reform and Brexit, or have the reform people managed to sort of wash their hands of the consequences of Brexit? And what's your perception of younger persons'
Sorry,
opinions of reform? Is there a danger of the young vote that you've referred to actually being seduced by this party, which the BBC and the mass media have obviously decided are going to do very well indeed?
I think politics is incredibly volatile, and I think it's an incredibly dangerous environment when you have that level of political instability and political influence that can manipulate people's thinking. So I think you cannot assume anything in terms of the way directions may go. I think for a lot of people, even those who now think, well, perhaps Brexit wasn't such a good idea, there are lot of people who really got quite burned by the toxicity of the debate and have just cut off from it. They don't really want to engage with it, and even if they might support and think that Brexit was a bad idea and it would be a good idea if we did rejoin, don't want to be part of anything that reignites that level of toxic debate that we have. So I think that is an element as well within there. So, and I think that's something that has to be overcome, and I think that requires real leadership from Westminster.
So, Marianne, sorry, I think I interrupted you earlier on. Do you want to come back in?
Yeah, no problem. No, I was just going to make one last point, really, with regard to the younger generations and the new young voters. I mean, I just get the impression that they're not readers of the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Star, the Sun. They're not print media readers, and they are getting their information and sharing views in totally new and different ways, which is encouraging, I think, because those newspapers, they're peddling the same stories the whole time, but they're not reaching. I don't think they're
Just to
ever the
say,
print media.
it's encouraging, but some of those social media sources are equally dangerous and
Right. Okay. Yes. Yes. Because I don't look at those.
sometimes even more
So
insidious
yeah. Yeah. No, I take that
about
point.
that as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Can I just say one other thing on young voters? Of course, certainly within Welsh elections, and it may be the case, I think it's going to happen within UK elections, that giving the vote to 16-year-olds means that the issue of engagement and political education is going to become even more important than it has. I think it's always been, we've neglected it at our peril. And when eventually I'm afraid the legislation for automatic registration of voters goes on board, far more attention to people from the age of 16, which means really attention to people from the age of 13, 14, 15 as well, because you don't suddenly jump into being able to vote. You need an educational process that empowers
Yeah,
people
we were
to play a greater role in the electoral system and civic education.
yeah, we were talking about the importance of introducing civics into the school curriculum 40 years ago when I was a young school teacher, and that still hasn't been achieved. Maybe to some extent with the new Welsh curriculum, but not, I would guess, with 16-year-old voters in mind. So
I agree. I agree with that, and it's one of the things I raised. I mean, I took through the Senate reform bill and, of course, the electoral reform legislation on this. This is one of the things that I've kept emphasising, and of course, the curriculum will make it a bit. You have to have teachers that are actually capable of teaching civic education, that understand it themselves. My experience is that there are some that are very, very good. There are others that really don't have a clue, and it's in a very technical way, but the materials and everything else that's required. So we've got a long way to go on this. Sorry for intervening.
Rhiannon's had a hand.
Yeah, over to you then, Rhiannon.
Yeah, I'd like to make a couple of points, and I'd like to go back to what Liz's question about what's going on in Wales as regarding twinning, and what our MPs doing about raising the questions about a closer relationship with Europe and joining the single market and the customs union. So where I live in Swansea, we have a twinning association in Mumbles. It's a very strong one. I'm not myself involved in it, but one of our Swansea for Europe members is, and is very active in it. And I have to say that Plaid Cymru members of Parliament have raised this issue in Parliament. Liz Savile Roberts has done it, and Plaid Cymru wants us to join the single market and the customs union. So there are MPs that are punching above their weight in that sense. And also regarding citizenship, I absolutely agree, lessons, I absolutely agree with it. I think it's a question of, as I think Charles has said, proper resources, proper training, that teachers can actually deliver this political education, because it's a great step forward the Welsh curriculum has made, but it's the kind of catch-up thing now that we've got to train the teachers to do it, and the adequate resources to deliver it. And we must remember that there's now a cohort of young people who have never, really not known being in the European Union, or been of an age that they were aware of it. As you said, it's 9 years ago. So it's a bit of an abstract concept to them, perhaps, what it meant for us to be in the European Union. So, it's a great deal of work to do in this regard. So getting into schools and is absolutely vital. Further education colleges as well. I think this is something that we should be looking at, all of us. So thank you very much.
Can I just responding to that? I mean, I'd actually appreciate you telling me a little bit more about how the twinning is actually operating and what it's achieving, what it's doing. I see very little coming out of Westminster in terms of pushing for single market and so on. I mean, it seems to me politics has become very top down in Westminster in terms of the government, and in Wales we're obviously able to talk far more openly. We do talk far more openly about the impact on Wales, and we did so, of course, over the previous years as well. But I'm sort of disappointed at the level of debate on this issue within Westminster, and the fact that we're not looking at seizing the opportunity that this is actually, I think, in terms of, if the growth agenda is the priority agenda, then the biggest step that you could actually take in terms of growth and economic confidence is actually to start moving towards rejoining, re-engagement, certainly with the single market, the customs union, would be very, very significant and would see probably the quickest impact to economic benefit than any other individual measure that government could take at this moment in time. And that's why I'm disappointed there is the growth of that particular debate. Maybe it will come. On the curriculum, look, training teachers. I mean, I agree with everything you said about that. I also do know. I mean, schools are very nervous about the idea of political education, which is why we use the term civic education. But that's partly, I think, out of a lack of confidence in terms of the resources and support that exists in terms of how you do it, the materials that are available to do it, the framework within which it happens. Some schools are very, very good at it. Other schools, to be honest, try to avoid it, perhaps for some of those reasons.
Thank you, Mick. Richard?
Thank you very much. I think this topic of civic education is going to be very important throughout the country. But Mick, you referred to the toxicity of Brexit and particularly of the referendum. And I personally don't see a second referendum as the way ahead necessarily, because it will be so toxic again. And in my view, the best way forward actually would be for one of the political parties to put it in its manifesto for an election and say, we're going to campaign to join again. Will you support us? The question then, of course, is which political party is going to do that soon? Because the Conservatives aren't ready to do so yet. Labour is not ready to do so yet. Lib Dems and Greens and others might. But this also begs a related question around proportional representation, because if we had proportional representation, then you'd have a different selection process for putting people into Parliament. Certainly into Westminster, you've got a certain amount of PR coming into the Senate, but how do those two things relate to each other and relate to the whole process of civic education for young people?
Well,
any thoughts?
I think taking your last point. Yeah, sorry, the sound cuts out every now and then, so
it was cutting out for me too. So
not talking earpiece. Yeah, well, the starting point is, I think the first past the post system is massively distorting politics. It's forcing politics into a particular direction, into a particular minority framework. It excludes people. It narrows the debate within which politics is debated and takes place. It's partly the cause of why people feel as though their voice doesn't really count, because in many ways, the first past the post system, under that, their voices don't really count within it. I think the first past the post system is basically a blight on democracy. It's way past its sell-by date. It worked after the Second World War, when really you only really had two political parties. It didn't really make that much difference. But the environment is very, very different now, and the failure to embrace the need for change in a form of proportional voting is, I think, one of the biggest challenges in respect of the democratic health of our society. And I think democracy is on a precipice. So one of the reasons why we wanted to introduce the proportional voting system that we will have within the Senate, that creates its own challenges, but we have to accept that probably the next Senate will be more representative of the way people vote politically than any previous Senate. I think I generally recognise that. In terms of toxicity, well, I think you're right, and I think it's one of the reasons why you can't predict how people might vote, whatever their feelings towards the European Union. But we have that toxicity is carrying through at the moment anyway. But there are steps towards that should fall short of initially joining, and that is becoming part of the single market. that not joining the single market was a political choice that was made. You could be part of the single market without joining the EU and all the functions and responsibilities that came with that. But for all the reasons we know, without going into the details, that has been rejected, and it doesn't seem to be on the UK government's agenda, despite the fact it could be the most significant boost to economic growth, I think, of all the steps government could take, certainly in the short term.
But single market membership would also require freedom of movement of people. And
Yeah.
that's still a big catch-all for most people in England, at least.
Yeah, and it's difficult to understand why it is. The idea that
Yeah,
you want
I
to
know.
restrict your kid. I mean, it's one of the narrowness of debates that we failed to sort of take on or failed to convince people on, and that's why probably the younger generation or certain elements of the younger generation are more likely towards favourable towards things like that. But I mean, again, it's part of the reason why we've got this cross-party group. One of the reasons why we want to have things like Erasmus or the development of the tithe model, but it's also one of the reasons why we do want to move back to the single market.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Mick. Any other questions? Okay, well, we can't let you go, Mick, without getting your perceptions of recent events concerning Ukraine. To my mind, what I've seen on the television the last couple of days confirms that we must have ever closer union in Europe. And it's only when Europe becomes involved that we see adults on the scene with some realistic ideas for the future. Very disappointed with Starmer's reaction to the Putin.
Well, I came back from Ukraine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go on, Mick.
I came back from Ukraine. Sorry, it's again the thing with the sound going in and out. I'm not sure whether it's my system or someone else everywhere else. Came back from Ukraine about 4 weeks ago. We drove through and then round through Kyiv to Pavlograd to Dnipro, all of which have been under intense. We've met with military units there. We met with the trade unions there. We did have earlier, interestingly, a Senate delegation in April to Ukraine, and there we went to see the Gareth Jones Street, named after the Welsh journalist, and we are hoping to go back and have a plaque put up, a trilingual plaque put up there. So the connection between Wales and Ukraine are very interesting, and I think are growing. And we're looking at a lot of twinning between towns and cities in Ukraine and Wales. But I'm going out again tomorrow. Basically, it's like a game of chess, isn't it? I mean, the fact of the matter is, the only real relevant force now, as far as Ukraine's concerned, is going to be Europe. And I think the role that Starmer's played within that and pulling together that European grouping has been actually fundamental in, I suppose, putting pressure on Trump. And people tell me and so on, is they don't trust him anymore. And the fact of the matter is, you can't trust Putin, but you equally say you can't trust Trump as to where he's going to go and what he's going to do. And so the role of Europe is now increasingly important. The leverage of the United States has been diminishing, but is still incredibly significant in terms of the military power and economic power that Russia, Ukraine, they feel that America has been a betrayal. They look far more towards Europe as being the basis of future support, whilst not wanting at the same time. Is anything going to come of this? My gut feeling is the answer is no, because until you actually sort out the issue of sovereignty, until you sort out the issue of the 20, 30,000 abducted children, till you sort out the issue of reparations, war crimes, and so on, to those who've been done. Putin wasn't offering he was offering a ceasefire if Donbass was handed over to him along the Zaporizhia front and Kherson front, but said nothing about Sumy and Kharkiv, where there is still enormous conflict taking place. So none of these issues have been addressed or resolved. What happens if Putin doesn't play? Putin would just continue to play for time. He has an inexhaustible at the moment supply of bodies. The estimate is that Russia is losing 6-1 in terms of casualties and deaths. But of course, Ukraine is not in a position where it can afford. You can just continually enroll countless numbers of people and throw them into the old Stalin style front line, send them over the top, shoot them if they head back at all. So the war at the moment is not. There is very little movement. There was a certain amount of Russian advance in the east, and Ukraine moved in more troops, and that's been pushed back. And now Ukraine has advanced back into some of the occupied areas. There's very little movement on that particular front line, but Ukraine has a major issue in terms of certainly. I think it's impossible for Ukraine to say that it will cede areas that it currently occupies. There's a big issue as to, well, what do you do about the 7 or 8 million displaced people? What is their role? What do you do about those people that are currently living in the occupied areas? Would you subject them to Russian rule, when the likelihood is for many of them it can mean deportation, it can mean oppression in many particular ways, certainly the prohibition of the Ukrainian language and so on. So it's difficult to see that any of those issues have actually been addressed. The only thing that's come out of it is a suggestion that there could be, some sort of European input into, peacekeeping force or whatever. But that doesn't resolve the longer term issues. So at the moment, without a ceasefire, which was always the primary demand, it's difficult to see how you can have discussions over a peace agreement when you've still got missiles flying around, you've still got thousands of drones flying around, you've still got people being killed backwards and forwards at any particular time. I think what it all represents, though, is a complete weakness of American policy and certainly a weakness of European unity. European unity is now becoming stronger as they begin to realize that they'll have to stand alone. I don't see how NATO exists really anymore, because once that bond of trust has been broken, when you can't say with confidence you could rely on what one of the major partners, i.e. America, would do, then effectively NATO is effectively Europe. And I think the sooner that is recognized officially, the better, because certainly with America at the moment, the idea is to, will someone support you, won't they support you, etc. I think that is long gone, and I think the confidence in America is basically one of not there yet. So I don't have a great deal of confidence in it at the moment. I'll certainly get more feedback from family when I go over, and from some of the people I'll be meeting when I go over to Ukraine in the next week. So the lack of uncertainty. Biggest issue, if there were to be any agreement, what are the security guarantees? Putin has broken every agreement he's ever had. A purely written agreement would be no more than the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, destroyed its strategic bombers and all its other major international weaponry on the basis of a signed agreement to protect its territorial sovereignty. Well, the reality is something like that just really has no basis of credibility in the world, or certainly not in Ukraine. He had the same peace agreement they had with Chechnya, and then 3 years later he reinvaded Chechnya. The same with Georgia. So in some ways, for any progress to be made, it's very much dependent, I think, on a genuine security guarantee. And certainly no one seems to be talking about the reality as to what that would amount to. I think that is the challenge. Everyone I know in Ukraine wants peace. I've lost family members. Nearly everybody has, one way or another, is impacted. But it's got to be a peace that is going to sustain, not just a delay of another 2 years and everything will kick off again and Russia will be in an even stronger position. That's my take.
Thanks, Mick. So maybe the best news would be if Trump fails or sees himself as being forced to fail by Putin, and at the same time, Britain has got a choice really to make, isn't it? We've got to decide whether we're going to be on the coattails of a very unpredictable USA, or whether we are going to more closely integrate with Europe. The present Starmer model of Europe plus UK just doesn't wash.
Yeah. And I think there's a real issue with the EU now in terms of Ukrainian accession and so on. You know, it's got to be serious about this. If it really is believe that Ukraine is the front line of democracy in Europe, then you've got to actually bite the bullet of what that means in real hard politics. It's not something you can faff around with. The Baltic states recognise that. I think Poland does as well, because they are the potential next front line on this. So, you know, there's some really hard red lines to be drawn over this that have to be stood up, and at the moment it's very difficult when, you know, every time there's a discussion with Trump and Putin. International law is never been weaker in the world, and we see that with the terrible situation in Gaza and what's happening to the Palestinians as well. You know, and in many ways, the rule of law and international law has been subverted in a way no one would actually thought would be possible. It was always weak and it was always at risk of challenge, but you know, it is now. Question is whether international law in any real sense exists, and it raises very serious questions about the, you know, the nature of the United Nations and its current structure as well.
Okay, Mick, on that note,
that happy note.
Yeah, things can only get better. Thanks for your attendance tonight, Mick, and for your contribution. Thanks for everybody for turning up. Hope to see many of you in London on the 18th, and don't forget there's an option of a coach going along the M4 that'll pick you up on the 18th of October, and Waves for Europe has got a couple of interesting sessions before then, and we'll keep you in touch with those. So over to you then, Gareth, if you want to close things down. And I say good night, no star to everybody.
Right, no star. Diolch yn
No
fawr
star,
iawn.
Charles.
Bye, everybody. Hwyl fawr.
No star, everybody. Hwyl.